Portable amplifiers are a dime a dozen, except they cost thousands of dimes. It's a nice little scam companies have going. Some portable amp DACs are complete garbage products not worth the discount on Amazon. Others are good products that are simply overpriced. And then there's the hype, especially when a big-name company is involved. If Audeze released a mediocre portable amp DAC tomorrow, you can bet a lot of the usual reviewers would drool all over it. In my opinion, portable amp DACs do not need to be expensive, and if you know your headphone requirements, it should not be that difficult to find a reasonably priced amp DAC. Earlier this year, the Earmen TR amp was released. It got some mixed reviews, and I really do not think it was a huge splash in the market. This portable amp DAC has some impressive specifications, but at $250, it is a very expensive purchase. Let's take a look at the TR amp and find out if it is a noteworthy product or yet another expensive product for those who like shiny things. By the way, I'm going to refer to the TR amp as Tramp. Earmen is a company founded by the founder of Oriolus Audio. Oriolus is an old name in audio. They make some incredibly expensive amplifiers, some costing several $1,000s. Earmen is the brand aimed at the more average audiophile, at least in price and design. Earmen currently has 4 products: the Tramp, a desktop DAC, and 2 portable USB DAC amps. Their products use either Cirrus Logic or Sabre DACs. Earmen's design philosophy is pretty minimalistic. Compared to the higher-end Oriolus line, the Earmen look downright homebrew. In short, Earmen is not a new Chinese company. It's got heritage in an established European company. Does that mean that the Earmen Tramp is a big winner? It's a real chore to regurgitate the specifications that are easily available online. So if you are interested, just Google the Tramp and take a look. The important information is that the Tramp does MQA decoding, DSD 128 32-bit PCM, and has a Sabre DAC. The Tramp has 3.5mm and quarter-inch jacks that can be used at the same time. The maximum power output is 400 milliwatts at 16 ohms and 350 milliwatts at 32 ohms. The Tramp was made for easy portable use. It is plug-and-play with iOS, Android, Windows, and Mac. You can download a Windows driver if you want, but you really don't need to. In short, the Tramp has respectable numbers. You have no idea what this means unless you can compare the Tramp to something else. Let's look at the Monolith THX Portable and topping NX4. The Monolith and NX4 do not have MQA decoding. Both support PCM up to 32 bits at 768 kHz. The NX4 supports DSD 512, whereas the Monolith supports DSD 128. Just like the Tramp, the Monolith and NX4 do not have balanced output. Of course, the Monolith has the THX amp module and the other two do not. The Monolith has 220 milliwatts at 16 ohms and 340 milliwatts at 32 ohms. The NX4 has 293 milliwatts at 32 ohms. Consequently, you can see that the Tramp is a little bit more powerful at 32 ohms and lower impedances. However, how the Tramp performs at higher impedances is anyone's guess. It is frustrating when companies do not provide power output numbers for more headphone impedances. Nevertheless, if you have 32 ohm headphones, it is clear that any of these 3 amp DACs will have plenty of power to drive them. Moreover, all 3 devices have slightly different feature sets. The Monolith has a digital display that provides for a sub-menu system. Within these menus, you can set several EQ parameters and activate the fake spatial effect. The NX4 has a gain and bass boost switch. The Tramp can act as a preamplifier with its line-out RCA. The Monolith is about $260, though you can find it on discount throughout the year. The NX4 is $160. The Tramp has excellent build. It is sturdy and housed in an aluminum casing. The volume knob is metal. The preamplifier switch on the back is also metal. The device is fairly light and can easily fit within your palm. However, compared to the NX4 and the Monolith, the Tramp is a fat unit. I like the fact that Earmen included USB-C for charging and data. I also like having 2 separate USB ports for this. This means that you can power the Tramp with a portable battery pack while connected to your phone. Moreover, this also allows full compatibility with mobile devices since the data port is not asking for power from your portable source, which can be an issue for iOS. As for battery life, Earmen says that the Tramp gets up to 10 hours. Obviously, that will depend on your headphones, volume, and whether you are using MQA or DSD or PCM. Using only high-resolution PCM files and connected to a 32-ohm headphone, I got no more than just about 7 hours. There is no true battery indicator on the Tramp. There is one small LED on the front, but that LED doubles as the power, audio format, and battery indicator. For example, if you play PCM files, then that light will be green. Use MQA and it will turn to magenta. You get a flashing red light when the battery is below 20%. Of course, this can cause some frustration for those who are not near a power source and did not bring a charging cable with them. In contrast, the Monolith has a digital display that shows the battery level. It won't give you a numerical battery level, but it is a significant improvement over the emergency countdown timer that the Tramp offers. Then there is the channel imbalance. The Monolith does not have any channel imbalance. The NX4 does not have channel imbalance. The Tramp does, and it is quite noticeable on my 32-ohm headphones. Mute on the Tramp is about 8 o'clock on the volume knob. On 32-ohm headphones, I can start hearing music at just past 9 o'clock. And at that volume, there is significant imbalance. The left channel is audible, whereas the right channel is dead silent. Turn the knob just a little bit more and the channels balance. For full-size headphones, this likely is not going to be a huge problem, since by the time you get balanced left and right, you'll be at a comfortable volume. But for IEMs or sensitive headphones, you might already be past safe listening levels by the time the channels do balance. I find this to be quite unacceptable for a device that costs as much as the Tramp does. Perhaps it is a fault with my unit and not present in others. Overall, the build is fine. It's no better than the NX4 or the Monolith. The Tramp uses the Sabre 9038 Q2M DAC. Earmen says that this is a, quote, reference class DAC. Well, whatever. It's a DAC with its own sound signature, and it can be referenced if you want it, just like a Burr Brown DAC can be reference DAC with its own peculiar sound. Anyway, if you used a Sabre device in the last 10 years, you probably encountered harsh sound. I know I did. Sabre DACs were known for grain and harsh, peaky treble. I think part of the problem was that audio companies which deployed Sabre DACs simply did not know how to tune them. The current line of Sabre DACs have more control and finesse. Indeed, I have heard Sabre tuning that is both analytical and neutral, and it all depends on the device. As for the Tramp, I would say that it is close to neutral, though not quite there. The Tramp has a slight analytical tilt, one that does not become too harsh. I compared the Tramp to the Monolith Portable and NX4. The Monolith has an analytical sound signature and the NX4 is fairly neutral. The tested devices, I paired them with the Allo Audio S4, an open back headphone that is one of the most neutral I have ever heard. I plugged each device into my PC and played music off of Amazon Music HD. I tried to volume match. I did not use the bass boost or other EQ on any device unless I specifically say so in this review. The Tramp fits somewhere closer to the Portable's sound signature. Cymbals tend to sound a little bit more tinny than on the NX4, and have a weird spike that can be fatiguing if you listen to songs that extensively use drum kits. The transients is fairly quick and there is a lack of warmth to the overall sound signature. I will explain all of this in more detail. Bass on the Tramp is on the analytical side. There seems to be a sub-bass roll-off. When I played my bass test tracks such as Mountains, Pure Water, and Conquer, I heard a noticeable difference between the Tramp and the NX4. The Tramp always rendered sub-bass rumble more quietly. In Mountains, for example, the initial sub-bass rumble was present on the Tramp but reduced. On the NX4, that rumble was louder and clearly more accurate. In Conquer, the multiple bass instruments combined on the NX4 and presented a thick reverberation of the sub-bass. However, on the Tramp, that same rumble was reduced. The reverberation that I heard on the NX4 was either entirely missing on the Tramp or just far leaner on the Tramp. In Pure Water, the Tramp was not accurate at all with the bass. No matter how loudly I played the song, the Tramp simply did not present the sub-bass. That characteristic subwoofer effect in this song was mostly missing. Vocals remained clear, but the sub-bass and mid-bass did not have accurate presentation, as I said. Whatever sub-bass was recreated melded with the mid-bass. On the NX4, the sub-bass was more obvious. It did not bloat, but did meld with the mid-bass. The mid-bass impact was slightly more impactful here than on the Tramp. Vocals remained clear, although the bass did meld slightly with them. When I repeated the test on the Monolith, I noticed that the sub-bass presentation was very similar to that of the Tramp. However, the Monolith tended to have just a few decibels additional mid-bass impact. This could have been due to inaccurate volume matching. On the other hand, the Monolith had better bass and mid separation, whereas the bass did not meld as much as it did on the Tramp and the NX4. The difference here was marginal but noticeable in an A/B test. The overall bass response was not a huge shift from one amp DAC to the other. Yes, there are definite differences when you do an A/B test. Yes, each has its own particular sound signature. But I suspect that if you did a blind test, people would have a hard time distinguishing among these three products. I will emphasize that none of these three devices sounds like the hifi hip DAC, which has a warmer U-shaped sound. In that respect, the Monolith, Tramp, and NX4 share something in common. They are closer to neutral than the hip DAC. But if I had to break down these DACs more, I would have to say that the NX4 is the most neutral of the three. The Monolith and Tramp are very close, but the Tramp seems to have a slightly leaner, more analytical and clinical bass presentation. I think mids are not quite neutral on the Tramp and unfortunately exhibit some unpleasant tendencies depending on your recording. I want to emphasize that the Olo headphone is pretty neutral and it does not accentuate sibilance or add grain or distortion. Consequently, the information I am about to impart has everything to do with the songs and DAC combinations. The Tramp elevates sibilance and grain that are recorded into a track. For example, Orla Gartland's song Why Am I Like This has sibilance in her voice and there is just a layer of grain in the vocals. This is entirely natural. Some DACs smooth this out and some do not. The Tramp boosted Orla's sibilance by several decibels and also elevated the grain in her voice. This resulted in a fairly harsh sound signature, one which is not accurate. When I played Want You Back by Haim, the Tramp again exhibited odd sibilance performance. The primary vocalist has sibilance in her voice, but the Tramp elevated it. Here's what I mean. Between 7 seconds and 50 seconds into the song, you can hear many words which end in the letter S. That is where the sibilance primarily comes from. The Tramp elevated that sound and brought it forward more than it should have been, so that the S sound lingered longer than it should have. Moreover, when the backup vocalist joined the song 51 seconds in, there are drums and clapping. The clapping sounded more like wooden sticks being hit. I think I got this impression because the clapping effect was sharper on the Tramp than I recall hearing it before on other devices. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the ukulele sounded off-timbre and had a rather metallic sound signature. It's a little hard to explain. It is almost as if each note had changed octaves. The bass guitar was in the background, just audible. The drums lacked impact and presence and sounded like they were just a set of children's drums than actual normal people drums. Again, the timbre was way off in my opinion. On the positive side, the sibilance in the male vocalist was accurate and not elevated, not rolled off. On the Monolith, things were a little different. The Monolith still elevated the sibilance in Orla's voice, but it did not add or enhance the grain as the Tramp had. I could still hear the grain, but it was softer than it had been on the Tramp. Nevertheless, the Monolith and Tramp still shared an analytical sound, where the bass did not have an accurate impact and the vocals lacked warmth and instead had a more tinny, thin effect. In Want You Back, the Monolith had far more controlled presentation of the primary vocalist sibilance. It was much more accurate than on the Tramp. The clapping in the song sounded like actual clapping and not sticks being hit together. It was a noticeable difference in this regard from the Tramp. In Superposition, the ukulele had a similar sound to how it sounded on the Tramp. However, it was not nearly as tinny sounding on the Monolith. The bass guitar had just a tiny bit more presence on the Monolith, but not by much. The primary vocalist sibilance was very similar between the Monolith and the Tramp, which is perfectly fine with me. The drums sounded thicker on the Monolith with slightly greater impact. I'm not going to bore you about the NX4, I will simply summarize my findings here. The NX4 had the most neutral presentation of these three devices. Orla's voice was a little bit smoother on the NX4, her sibilance was more accurate than it had been on the Monolith or the Tramp. The NX4 recreated the grain in her voice, but it did not become harsh as it had on the Tramp. In Want You Back, the NX4 did not enhance the vocalist sibilance. It was very neutral and her voice was smooth. The clapping sounded accurate, claps sounded like claps, and sounds of snapping fingers sounded exactly as they should. In Superposition, the drums sounded perfectly neutral. They had more impact than on the Monolith or the Tramp. The vocalist's sibilance was accurate, and the bass guitar was a bit more audible than it had been on the other two devices. Overall, the mids were more neutral on the NX4 than on the Monolith or the Tramp. What I simply could not understand is why the Tramp sounded so harsh with some tracks and retained its tinny nature. Yes, there were some similarities between the Tramp and the Monolith, but the Monolith simply did not sound as harsh as the Tramp does. Whereas you could say that the Monolith is an analytical amp DAC, I really do not know how to describe the Tramp. It is analytical, but the grain and sibilance on this product are simply hard to accept. I must concede that your music and headphones will render a different experience. Consequently, if you have warm-sounding headphones, then you may not experience the issues I experienced here. But with a neutral set of headphones, yeah, not favorable presentation of the mids in my opinion. The treble response on the Tramp fares a little better than the mid's performance. The Tramp has fairly good treble extension and clarity, but it is definitely a little elevated. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the horns and brass cut through the mix without difficulty. Those instruments were clear and distinct. However, they also had a bit more energy than they should, at some points reaching my personal treble threshold. There was good separation of group sets, and the horns and brass appeared to have accurate timbre. I did not hear any distortion or grain. In Flight from the City by Johan Johansson, the piano sounded fairly accurate and neutral. The Tramp's bass roll-off helped a lot here, I think. Through the Tramp, the Aulo presented the piano as if it was no more than 5 feet away from me. And since the bassier notes were less emphasized on the Tramp, that allowed the other frequencies to come through without distortion. The cello was clear and fairly accurate. On Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the saxophone was clear and precise. Its timbre seemed just about right to me, though it did get a little peaky. The Tramp's treble push did not affect the saxophone too much and was still under my personal treble threshold. Drums sounded less present than they should have, and the piano was even further back, sometimes lost in the mix when the saxophone was dead center. On the NX4, all of these tracks had a different impression. On Scherzo for X-Wings, the brass and horns were clear and precise with accurate timbre. They cut through the mix but did not sound harsh or peaky, and certainly not to the extent that they had on the Tramp. However, treble clarity was a little bit better on the Tramp. On Flight from the City, the bassier notes on the piano melded with some of the others but did not cause distortion. The piano was a little muddier on the NX4 compared to the Tramp, but only because of the bass slightly melding with the other frequencies. The cello was smoother on the NX4. On Take 5, the saxophone was smoother than on the Tramp. That peakiness I heard from the Tramp was completely gone, allowing me to relax a little bit and enjoy the music. The piano was clearer and more present, as were the drums. Whereas the Tramp had a more tinny, analytical approach to the song, the NX4 had a more neutral one. The Monolith's performance was similar to the Tramp, though with slight differences. On Scherzo for X-Wings, the horns and brass had just a tiny bit less emphasis, though cut through the mix anyway. Whereas on the Tramp, these instruments had reached my personal treble threshold, they were a little bit easier on the Monolith. On Flight from the City, the piano sounded very similar on the Monolith as it had on the Tramp. There was an analytical, tinny quality to some of the notes, a quality that was entirely different from the NX4. I think the bassier notes were just a tiny bit more emphasized on the Monolith than on the Tramp, though the differences were rather minor. The cello sounded very similar as it had on the Tramp. On Take 5, the saxophone was just a little smoother on the Monolith than on the Tramp. The piano and drums were also slightly more present, pushed forward on the Monolith than they had been on the Tramp. Overall, the treble response is not what I would call neutral on the Tramp. There was treble elevation, sometimes causing fatigue, while other times being just under my personal pain threshold. The timbre never quite sounded accurate. Sometimes it would be a big difference and other times a minor one. Regardless, I never got the impression that the Tramp had accurate treble. Instead, I got the feeling that it was simply more accentuated treble. Combined with the bass roll-off, you end up with a treble response that is not quite balanced with the rest of the frequency range. People sometimes ask me about Soundstage on amps and DACs. I always reply with the same answer: there is no Soundstage with amps and DACs. I read quite often in forums and reviews that an amplifier or DAC has a certain soundstage, and I'm always struck by the utter silliness of it. Soundstage is a combination of the original recording methodology and headphones or speakers. I know that Audio Engine has written a few posts on their website about this subject, and they continually imply that amplifier components affect soundstage, but they have yet to explain how or why. The bottom line is this. Soundstage is created with a microphone placement and room design. It is recreated based upon the speaker or headphone design. You may be able to affect Soundstage by crosstalk or fake surround sound like Sensurround, but you're not adding or deleting anything new. Consequently, as far as my opinion on Soundstage goes, none of these devices has any effect whatsoever. As long as a device properly drives your headphones will recreate the soundstage to the best of their ability. Is it possible to hear any additional details on the Tramp? Again, amps and DACs do not create or delete the information that is already recorded. They can either accentuate or de-emphasize. In other words, if an amp DAC has a bass roll-off, then the details in sub-bass rumble will not be pushed forward, and you may miss the information since it is not fully audible. On the other hand, if an amp DAC emphasizes bass and melds mid-bass with sub-bass, you may lose out on the definition and detail present in those frequencies because of the melding. If a particular frequency range is pushed forward, you might be able to hear a bit more detail present in that area that is accentuated. As for the Tramp, there is little bass definition and detail. Sub-bass is less than accurate, and mid-bass impact is somewhat blunted. There is not much detail to be gleaned from the way that the Tramp present bass, even when playing with bass-heavy songs like Conquer. The mids have some additional detail, but only the unfriendly kind. Sibilance in female vocalists is pushed forward, which results in an accentuated S sound that overstays its welcome. Grain is also sometimes elevated. The treble is well extended, but it is also accentuated. You can likely hear a few more details with a bit more clarity in some instruments like brass and horns. For example, the saxophone in Take 5 had some micro details pushed forward that the NX4 did not accentuate. Moreover, in Flight from the City, the bass roll-off on the Tramp allowed some of the middle frequency notes to come out clearer than they did on the NX4. In short, detail will depend heavily on your headphones and recording. Some instruments will sound less detailed than they should. Others will sound more detailed than they should. And if you are very lucky, sometimes you will hear instruments that are precise on the Tramp. I think it is safe to say that the Tramp is not a forgiving amp DAC. Harsh recordings will sound harsher, and good recordings may have sibilance and treble accentuated beyond neutral. There is a place for more analytical amp DACs like the Tramp, and honestly, I do think that the Tramp is an analytical amp DAC. If you have warm-sounding headphones like the Philips X2 or a Sony or Audeze headphone, then the Tramp might pair well with those. If you want to hear a bit more clarity, then something like the Tramp will roll off the bass to get a bit more clarity. The sound signature is not that far off from the Monolith. The slight differences are really in mid-bass and sibilance. The Monolith has just a tiny bit more mid-bass impact and slightly smoother sibilance. But the Tramp is quite different from the NX4, which I would say is smoother and more neutral by a long mile. As I listened to the Tramp, I tried to think if it did anything unique. Does it have a sound signature that is flattering? Does it have features I can use? Does it somehow add convenience I did not previously have? The answer is no. The Tramp simply does not do anything better than competitors, but it does not have to do anything better, just different. Instead of getting caught in the better, best, bestest nonsense, we should instead consider if the particular device complements our setup. In that respect, yes, I think the Tramp can contribute something. You see, when paired with a neutral headphone like the oriolus 4, the Tramp just sounded too harsh for my liking. But when paired with the Sennheiser HD579, the experience was different. The harshness was much reduced, and instead of a warm-sounding 579 that I typically hear with products like the Hip DAC, I heard more clarity and slightly more detail through the Tramp. But we have to ask one simple question. Who is this amp DAC for? At $250, the Tramp puts itself in a precarious situation. It's a ton of money, and the Tramp has to justify the cost. What does the Tramp do that cannot be achieved with other products? Well, the specifications say it has a lot of power for 32-ohm headphones, and that is certainly true in my experience. But both the NX4 and Monolith have plenty of power in that regard as well. The Tramp can play high-resolution PCM and DSD-128, but both the NX4 and Monolith play higher resolution PCM and at least DSD-128. Realistically, however, very few people have such high-resolution audio, and these numbers are typically pointless jibber-jabber. The Tramp has RCA output. That's unique to the Tramp in this comparison, but both the NX4 and Monolith have line-out jacks, so you can get a 3.5mm to RCA cables and achieve the same thing. The Tramp's battery life is not really that much better than the NX4 or Monolith. They're all around the 6 to 7 hour mark. In build, the Tramp is equally well built as the Monolith and the NX4. In size, the Tramp is very large, and far larger than a portable amp DAC needs to be. The Tramp does not have gain or bass boost, no EQ options, and no filters. Both the NX4 and Monolith have each of some of this. But the Tramp does have MQA decoding, and the other two amp DACs do not. As I consider this product, I am less and less impressed and more ambivalent. It is a fine product in itself. The sound signature is not too different from the Monolith. If that is the flavor you enjoy, then you may find the Tramp a good audio experience. But I simply cannot condone $250 for something whose practical justification hinges on MQA and analytical sound. I find MQA a sketchy prospect. It is overhyped and requires so much investment that it is simply not worth the effort. There are plenty of people who swear by Tidal and MQA, and I simply cannot understand why. True, MQA does provide slightly better resolution and fidelity over Spotify, but is no better and sometimes worse than high-resolution PCM through Amazon Music HD. The cost of MQA services like Tidal is simply unacceptable in the long run. Then add the cost of decoding hardware, and now you have spent a lot of money to get sound that is easily stumped by Amazon's high-resolution audio. On the flip side, if you are devoted to the MQA world, then you have very few alternatives. You can opt for one of the AudioQuest devices, but are limited to their form factor and power output. Or you can try the hip DAC, but it has its own particular sound signature that you may not find convincing. The hip DAC provides higher power output through its balanced output than the Tramp does on its, single-ended output, because it doesn't have balanced. So I see a niche Earmen has tried to carve out. With the Tramp, you get a semi-portable device with good power output, clean sound, and analytical signature, and MQA support. If you think that the AudioQuest products lack power, then the Tramp might be the answer. But I simply cannot recommend the Tramp. I do not find its positives positive enough. Look, I am not a fan of MQA, and try as I might to be fair-minded, there is simply no justification for its existence. It is a service that is overhyped. It does not deliver anything better than competitors which are easily the same or cheaper price in the long run. I am also not convinced that the Tramp's sound signature is for the average audiophile. The sound is just too inconsistent to be reliable. In other words, you may enjoy soft, piano-centric music 1 minute, and then the next be very unhappy with the sibilance and grain you hear in vocal-centric songs. With warmer-sounding headphones, the Tramp does just fine, but so does the NX4 or the Monolith. This brings us to value. Overall, other than the spurious proposition that is MQA, I see no justification for the Tramp's $250 price tag. For the same price, you could get the Monolith with its plethora of EQ options and fake surround sound effect. For $100 less, you could get the NX4 with its more forgiving, more neutral sound in a similar package and with gain and bass boost options. Or, in the alternative, you could use the hip DAC, which offers MQA but at $100 cheaper than the Tramp. Unfortunately, the Tramp is difficult to like, at least for me. It's not a terrible product, but neither is it an excellent one. It is somewhere in the middle, and that is a bad place to be. There are other products for the same or cheaper price that offer more or offer things that are more useful than the Tramp. Consequently, even though the Tramp is an okay product, I really do not recommend it.